Hello everybody, welcome to this event at the York Festival of Ideas. My name's Isabel Berwick, I work at the Financial Times. I lead our Working It brand, it's about workplace, leadership, management. I'm delighted to be speaking to Simon Gilbody this evening about loneliness in the workplace. It's something we've discussed. I'm very interested in it from a work point of view. I'm glad you've all come to here. And we'll discuss the issues and we'll also offer some practical solutions. And we couldn't be in safer hands because Simon is Professor of, I'm going to have to read this, Psychological Medicine and Epidemiology at the University of York and the Hull York Medical School.
Got it.
He's also a practicing NHS psychiatrist and cognitive behavioural therapist. It's quite a lot, isn't it? Oh, unusually, he's also Professor of Epidemiology and is among the top 1% of the most highly cited scientists in the world. So we're very lucky to have Simon with us tonight. During the pandemic, he and his team conducted the largest ever trial to tackle loneliness at scale. So I think we'll hear more about that today. The results, I think, are going to be useful in thinking about how we deal with loneliness in a post-pandemic workplace. And it is a big issue. It's a growing issue. So I don't have anything else to say. I'm going to watch the slides. Please think of your questions. We'll have plenty of time for questions. I'm going to hand over to Simon. He's going to tell us how to fix loneliness in the workplace.
So, can you all hear me? All good? Thumbs up. That's fantastic. So, listen, I'm so pleased to be here. And there are three reasons I'm really pleased to be here. The first is, well, it's the Festival of Ideas. And, you know, the University of York sits at the heart of this amazing city. So, York's got this amazing history and also, you know, it's got a cultural vibrancy, and the fact that the Festival of Ideas sits amongst this, you know, is part of the nexus that exists here in York. So it's a wonderful thing. So I want to thank Joan, and also Naomi's not here, but she's downstairs. There's a lot of work that goes into this, and it's all free as well. So so that's all good. Well, pretty much 99% weekend. Yeah. So, it's very true, yeah. And the other reason I'm really pleased to be here is you get a chance to meet one of your heroes. So I'm here with Isabel, and Isabel's amazing, and she's got this great thing that exists in the Financial Times that helps us think in a really critical and quite light-hearted way about work and what work's like, and you know how we get through work. But she's also written a book which is just amazing. So I brought mine to get a signature, so you know, but I'm just going to give you a few highlights here. So if you want to work out how to manage people you really dislike, you know, this is a good place to start. So it's in Joan's book. What else was the other top tip I took from this? I've marked it here. How to exit a conversation without mentioning your bladder. So she's taught me a lot about networking, so this is a really good book. But there's also something on the front there. It says strategies for thriving at every stage in your life, and that's really useful. And Isabel wouldn't know this, but it's been quite influential in how I came to be talking about loneliness just at the moment, because if you'd have met me 5 years ago, you know, coming to the final third of my career, my glittering career in academia, in clinical practice in the NHS, and he asked me what I did, I wouldn't have said I research and I contemplate the nation of loneliness. And Isabel taught me that it's important to sort of think about what your priorities are and have the courage to take a left turn in your career. And this was a really interesting left turn that many of us in the room took. So I've noted that we've got Dr. Liz Littlewood at the back. So we've been on a bit of a shared journey about how we think about loneliness and how we think about scalable solutions to loneliness. And part of that was driven about trying to solve the immediate priorities and problems that face us. So this time 5 years ago, we were in the middle of the pandemic and we saw the mass imposition of social isolation. And as researchers and as people who had relatives who were becoming unwell as a consequence of loneliness, we decided to think about how we might respond to that. And this has evolved into one of the main things that we do as a research group here at the University of York. And it's the thing that preoccupies me and gets me to do really great gigs with Isabel Berwick. So that's all good. So I guess the final reason is, you know, get a chance to celebrate and talk to the outside world about the work that we do. So it's really nice to speak to people other than fellow academics every now and again. So I'm excited about this. And this programme's not thrown together. So we coincide the York Festival of Ideas with the Loneliness Awareness Week, which runs from the 9th to the 15th of June. So we're right in the middle of an awareness week that speaks about loneliness and how we might respond to loneliness as a society or as organisations or as individuals. And I've got a couple of people in the audience that we've been working with on that. So it's like synchronicity. So I'm sure that happened by design rather than by accident. So there we go. So who's that? Paul McCartney, wrong. Brian Wilson. Yeah, okay. So I didn't want to get through a talk this afternoon without mentioning Brian Wilson. So Brian Wilson, the force behind the Beach Boys, died yesterday. So it's like there's a funeral in the Gilbody household. So it's like Elvis and Prince and David Bowie and John Lennon all died at once because we've sort of lived and breathed the Beach Boys. So I'm going to put some non-too-subtle references to Brian Wilson and the Beach Boys as we go through. And part of that is because, you know, he created some of the greatest art of the 20th century, but as a practicing psychiatrist, he also recognised that he dealt with his own demons. So he very clearly had severe and enduring mental ill health across his lifetime, and that didn't stop him creating things that have enriched our lives in so many ways. So I'll find some non-too-subtle Brian Wilson references as we go through. So see which ones you can spot, and we may be taking questions at the end. So I sit within the Behavioural Therapeutics Lab along with some brilliant colleagues, some of whom are here today. And some of us are clinicians, but many of us have got methodological backgrounds, and either psychology or people have got social science backgrounds. Some people are very able statisticians, but one of the things that we do is we use behavioural science to think about how we can generate solutions to major population challenges. So usually that's around depression or anxiety, but lately and over the last 5 years we've been thinking about how we might respond to loneliness, and we think about what works in mental health. So we very explicitly think about clinical effectiveness, does it work? But because we're here in York, we also think about cost effectiveness. Is it good value for money, and who's going to pay for it? So I'll try to speak to those themes as we go through and talk about loneliness. So I've got a few slides, and I wanted to spend a few minutes sort of clearing up some terminology, help people think about what loneliness is and how that relates to the human condition. So I'm going to bore you a little bit with a dictionary definition there, which is that loneliness is a subjective, unwelcome feeling of lack or loss of companionship, which is really interesting. But I think it represents the fact that that's a drive, and it signals our need for human connection, because humans are hardwired for human connection. And I say hardwired in an evolutionary sense. So humans do better when they stick together. They can get food, they can do stuff, they can protect themselves. So this notion that humans do better if they exist in groups confers an evolutionary advantage. So you can quickly see, when you think about social connection in that way, that loneliness is one of those things that drives us to stay together as human beings. So it's a bit like hunger or thirst, a basic human drive. So we get hungry because we need food in order to nourish ourselves, and that makes us more likely to survive, and it makes us more likely to go on to reproduce. So that evolutionary perspective on loneliness is a really important one. And the trouble is you get this when you get a mismatch between the quantity and the quality of the social relationships that we have and those that we want. So loneliness exists when we aren't as many people as we want to hang out with. And it's a sort of chronic nagging unhappiness that people in the room might recognise. But it's probably more than social isolation. So if you take nothing else away from today's talk, then don't immediately equate social isolation with loneliness, because they are similar, but they're not one and the same thing. Because we would all know that sometimes we can be in the middle of a crowd amongst people, but we can feel very lonely. And the flip side of that is sometimes people might be isolated, but that's where they want to be because they crave isolation. So for some people, hell can be other people, and that's really important. You know, Greta Garbo said that she wanted to be alone. And I know people in my immediate life that don't get FOMO, they get JOMO, joy of missing out. So they quite like solitude. So don't confuse the two, but there is a sense that people who are socially isolated are at risk of becoming lonely. And loneliness is a bad place to be for lots and lots of reasons that I'll go on to talk about over the next few minutes. So what is loneliness, and more importantly, why is it something that we should be bothered about? Well, loneliness causes a whole host of problems, and everything that I know about loneliness was taught to me by a really excellent PhD student I had about 10 years ago. So Dr. Nicole Valtorta taught me everything I know about loneliness, and she taught me that loneliness impacts on our physical health to the extent that it increases your risks of all the bad stuff. So it increases your risk of heart attacks, of strokes, it increases your risk of dementia and cognitive decline, and the chances of you dying of a heart attack are advanced by about 30%. So this is a significant risk factor for all sorts of bad stuff happening physically. It is also particularly bad for our mental health, and this is how we came to be involved in trying to mitigate the impacts of loneliness. So it pretty much doubles your risk of depression and anxiety. And but the perhaps most important consideration when we think about loneliness in the workplace is that it drives a loss of economic productivity. And that's probably why we would want to be interested in loneliness and when we think about that in relation to the workplace. But there's a really helpful take-home statistic that has resonance and has traction, and people pick up on it every time I say that. And that is that loneliness is the new smoking. Loneliness is as bad for our health as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So, you know, this isn't fluffy stuff. This isn't stuff that's trivial. This is a major threat to public health, and it's now increasingly recognised that that is the case. And if we try to start a conversation about loneliness, it probably wasn't a topic for academic consideration to the extent that it was now. Certainly not 5 years ago, but there have been a few things that have happened in the intervening 5 years that have really accelerated that. The first is the pandemic. It brought loneliness into the national and international conversation. The mass imposition of social isolation at a population level made us think about human connection and the impacts and importance of loneliness. But there was also a really important report that came out just 2 years ago from the top doc in the United States. He's not Dr. Fauci, it's this chap, it's Dr. Vivek Murthy. And he served 2 terms as the Surgeon General in the United States. And he produced this really important report, and he drew on his own experience of being lonely whilst he was a junior doctor, whilst he was a medical student, and reflecting on the impact of that on his own mental health, and also thinking about the impact of that on physical health as well. And he called it loneliness is a hunger, a signal that we're lacking something for survival. And he highlighted the impacts on physical health, on our mental health, and on the economy of the United States. And this has been so important in terms of bringing it into the international conversation. It's fed into an important working group that's hosted by the World Health Organization. They're taking this very seriously now, at the same level of seriousness that they would consider a pandemic threat. So if we were to think about loneliness and why that's important for organisations, there are a few self-evident truths. And the first is that lonely workers are less productive for lots of reasons. And one of those reasons might be the impact on people's physical and mental health. So they're often depressed and anxious and unhealthy. Lonely workers are subject to very high levels of turnover. So people don't stay in jobs, they leave jobs precipitously early, and that incurs all sorts of problems for organisations and employers. And they're often present but absent at the same time, and that's sometimes called presenteeism. So people's economic productivity, their ability to do their job, is not as good as if loneliness were not present. And it affects about 1 in 5 or 1 in 10 workers. And the costs to the economy are really quite substantial. And just to unpack that notion of presenteeism a little, this is a phrase that was coined, I think, by the doyen of organisational psychology from the University of Manchester, the American professor Carrie Cooper. And he talks about presenteeism being the problem of workers being on the job, but because of ill health, they're not fully functioning. And that this can cut individual productivity by about 1/3 or more. And unlike absenteeism, being away from the job, presenteeism isn't always apparent and it often gets missed. So lonely workers disproportionately display presenteeism. So let's think about why that's important for organisations. So there's a cost associated with this, and a lot of the figures and a lot of the thoughts and ideas that I'm going to share come from an important report called Loneliness at Work that was produced by a couple of organisations but fed into a report for the all-party parliamentary group on tackling loneliness and connected communities. And it contributes to long-term inactivity. And Isabel and I spoke about this earlier in the week. We talked about how mental ill health is a drain on the national economy, and long-term economic inactivity is probably costing the economy within the next 5 years about £100 billion. That's twice as much as we spend on secondary education in this country. And it was calculated by the Department of Digital Culture, Media and Sport as being around £10,000, representing the cost per worker per year. If they display loneliness, turnover is very high. It costs quite a lot to replace someone when they leave a job early, the presenteeism and the absenteeism that I've just spoken about. And that probably leads organisations to think about what they might do if they were to try to deal with the epidemic of loneliness. And there are probably quite a few things and quite a few suggestions that come out of this report. And a few highlights that the report would suggest organisations do is that they need to prevent loneliness by thinking about the organisational culture. I'll be really interested in the thoughts of the audience, the thoughts of Isabel about how we might tackle that. But they also suggest that not everyone is going to be equally affected by loneliness, and there are particular high-risk individuals who are going to disproportionately be impacted by loneliness. And the other thing that they suggest, and this was written after the pandemic and after the shift to home working and hybrid working, is that we've got to find ways to support hybrid and home workers so that they can maintain the social contacts that they have that are inherent in the normal working environments. And this report also suggested that if you do something about loneliness, it's going to pay for itself several times over, that there's going to be good return on investment. But one of the things that it fell short of doing was suggesting any specific interventions that might be useful to tackle some of the psychological impacts of loneliness. So it asks a question but doesn't really answer it, and it asks that are there effective interventions that we can offer the lonely worker, and it wasn't really sure, doesn't give any clear recommendations. So this is where we come in York. We've invented some stuff here at York. We've developed some interventions and we've thought about how we can deliver those at scale, and we've taken the trouble to work out whether they are effective and whether they are cost effective. So that's where the York bit of the story comes in. So I'll spend a bit of time talking about our work. I will look in the direction of my esteemed colleague over there, I'm not going to name, but she was the person who made all this happen. So I'm going to talk about psychological approaches and whether they have a role. So there's some important advances that we've made in science over the past 5 years that allow us to be more confident about using psychological approaches. And this is what York does well. We design stuff and we test it to destruction, and we work out whether it works and whether it's cost effective. So this is where we get to toot our own trumpet a little bit. So, if we're going to formulate a psychological understanding of loneliness in the workplace, the bit that Isabel alluded to, the cognitive behavioural therapy bit of my job, is quite useful. And cognitive behaviour therapy encourages you to think about to break things down into thoughts and to feelings and to actions. And that's quite a useful way of bringing things together. And there's a bit of literature out there, and it makes it clear that loneliness at work is a process that drives these around in an unhelpful cycle. So we start by thinking that we're excluded from social conversations and interactions, and this is bad. So people feel as though they're excluded, they get fear of missing out and fear of exclusion, and this drives negative emotions. You feel unhappy, you feel distressed, and this leads to consequences, and these are behavioural consequences. You start avoiding social interaction, and social interaction is an inherently, ideally, a rewarding process. And if you take away the things that reward everyday interactions, then you very quickly become down and depressed and withdrawn, you become anxious, and this starts you thinking that you're excluded, and you get negative emotions, and then you avoid things even more. So it drives itself around. And the point of having a cognitive or a behavioural, in our case, formulation like this is it gives us ways in which we can intervene to try and break this unhelpful cycle. And that's what we do for a living here at York. So this is where we get the chance to introduce our own work, and this is perhaps a piece of work that I feel most proud of. So if I were to be knocked over by the number 4 bus on the way into the centre of York, and someone reads my obituary at my wake, I'd want them to talk about this work and the team that actually delivered this. So this is the behavioural activation in social isolation trial. And when we were at the threshold of the pandemic, we were just about to start a piece of research that looks at how we could improve the mental health of people with long-term health conditions. And then something happened in the NHS overnight. It moved on to a war footing. It said that we like your research, but unless it speaks directly to the immediate challenges of the pandemic, it ain't going to happen. You need to send your research team home and come back once the pandemic's over. But there was a caveat. They said, if you can come up with a research programme that speaks directly to the impacts of COVID, then we can make things happen for you. And boy, did the NHS make things happen. It made me proud to be part of this cumbersome, clumsy beast that's sometimes called the NHS. It showed me that the NHS, when it gets its act together, can do really impressive things. It moved onto a war footing, and it delivered a really impressive programme of research, the most famous of which is the vaccine rollout programme. We were able to test vaccines at speed and at scale. But we punted a proposition to something called the Urgent Public Health Programme that was organised by the National Health Service. And if your trial or your study was accepted onto the portfolio of studies called the Urgent Public Health Programme, then they made stuff happen. So we designed a trial and we delivered it at speed. It was probably about 5, maybe 8 weeks between us designing it and getting the first person randomised. So I'm looking over there for a bit of affirmation. And I think that's about right. And if you're involved in research in the NHS, it usually takes a lot longer than that, is all I would say. So at the heart of this was a telephone-delivered intervention based around behavioural activation that was useful in trying to break that cycle. So we used well-evidenced strategies to help people connect with the social contacts that they had, so maintain their social contacts, but also to build a greater number of social contacts with the caveat that they couldn't go around and knock on people's doors. So we got people to think creatively about making phone calls and about having greater levels of activity that work within the constraints of COVID. And people were very, very entrepreneurial in the way in which they engaged with a behavioural intervention. And it was, by some country mile, the largest ever trial of a psychological intervention to prevent loneliness or depression in at-risk populations. And cut to the chase, it was very effective in preventing both depression and a type of loneliness that was particularly impacted by COVID, what we call emotional loneliness. Because we're here at York, we tested the cost effectiveness of that, and it's good value for money, and most importantly, it's scalable. So we moved the dial in a short number of months to generate evidence that has been published in some of the leading journals in our own field, and the final results entered the public domain just a little over a year ago. And it is the largest trial ever undertaken to prevent loneliness ever and anywhere, and this is the highest level of clinical evidence that we generate in the NHS. So this was a randomised controlled trial, and we've also generated evidence of value for money and cost effectiveness, and it's compatible with the sort of evidence that we would need to get it into a guideline issued by the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, so NICE. And this is the same level of evidence that we would need in order to bring a new drug to market. And in time, we think this will feed into guidance that will be issued by the World Health Organization. So it's a nice piece of work, and it was a team effort, and it was the honour of my life to be part of the team that delivered that. And so we ask ourselves a few questions. So the first is, does it work? So, it reduced the levels of loneliness by about 78%, which is great. And this was persistent. It was there 90 days after the intervention had ended. So these were 8 sessions given over between 5 and 6 weeks. And it was still there after the programme had ended. It reduced levels of depression, and it also reduced levels of anxiety. So this was all good. And people really liked it. So I'm not going to embarrass myself by trying to replicate a Yorkshire accent, because I'm not by birth a Yorkshireman. But the person that spoke to us said that without these phone calls, I'd be a cabbage. I'd still be sat on the settee, I'd still be watching the TV and not speaking to anyone. And it fetched me out of my cocoon, and it got me doing stuff. So we're onto something here. We've made a significant advance in terms of the type of psychological intervention that we can use if we want to mitigate social isolation. We can prevent loneliness, and we can prevent depression. So there's a busy graph there that captures all the other trials that have gone on to date. And we can see there that there's a substantial acceleration of research since COVID. You won't be able to see it from the back, but a lot of them demonstrate what I'm going to call the double benefit. So at the top, we've got a benefit of loneliness, and there's a red squidge there that shows that we actually reduce loneliness by using cognitive or behavioural interventions. And at the bottom, we show that we can also demonstrate that we actually prevent the onset of depression. So we call this the double benefit of treating and preventing loneliness and depression. And the Basel trial, made in York, is the largest ever trial ever undertaken. So if we were to think about how we can help respond to loneliness in the workplace, well, there are other things that we can do before we get to using the evidence that I've just spoken of. So culture and infrastructure are really important. So organisations need to identify what really matters to their employees, and we need to ensure that there's alignment with corporate values and embed loneliness into, I guess, other well-being and welfare activities. And lots of organisations have a lot that goes on, so maybe they should start adding loneliness to those. There's an important role for, there's an important managerial role, and managers might want to take this within their purview and start offering support and guidance that can help managers to identify and help colleagues who are experiencing loneliness. And we think that managers probably need a bit of help doing that. And I'll say a little bit about how we might go about that. And people and networks are obviously really important. So learn how people were endlessly curious during the pandemic. Think about how they built networks to try and tackle loneliness, particularly whilst people are working remotely. So people were quite creative when it came to working remotely, and if we want to try and capture that, that's going to be helpful to think about how we respond to loneliness. Now, work and workplace design, I'm hoping this might come up a little bit within the discussion that follows on. Think about how employers have supported a dispersed workforce. Think about what's worked well, and think about the methods which can promote visibility and connection. So we think there's probably a lot that we can learn there. And there's probably a role with of organisations within the wider communities that they sit in and perhaps serve. And some employers have sought to tackle loneliness beyond their immediate workforce, and we see some great examples of that I can perhaps speak to. But more importantly, what do you do if you've got the lonely and isolated worker who is at risk of depression? So this is where we think our evidence might come in. So we perhaps need to start identifying care pathways for those who are lonely and try to use non-stigmatising psychological approaches. So the things that we do are we deprogram of any stigmatising language. We get rid of the psychobabble, which Isabel was particularly keen on when we spoke about it earlier. And these approaches are highly effective. They're good value for money and they generate return on investment. So with this being Loneliness Week, we've been spending a bit of time thinking about how we might use this in particular situations. So I'm very pleased that I've got Sarah Fitzell here from the one of the important charities that support people in the legal profession, many of whom tell Sarah and her team that they're lonely. And Sarah's helped us think about what I'm going to call top tips. So anyone who reads Viz will know what top tips are. So we tried to come up with some top tips about what we might do to think about loneliness. So the first thing was that we recognised that the law can be a really lonely place, and you can substitute any organisation or any profession for that. You know, all organisations, all professions are very lonely. And we've got some really simple, practical ideas that can help us feel more connected. So, number one, you know, if you want stuff to happen, you've actually got to plan that to happen. So try to make structured social activities happen. And we gave people a bit of advice about a great way to feel more connected is to explore your interests or develop some new ones. Join a group, a club, a volunteer activity. So volunteering is a very positive thing to do. It's really good for your mental health. Research tells us that. So this might be a book club, a sports team. Many people in the room know how active park run is, and they're always looking for volunteers, even if you don't want to do the 5k run. And this regular involvement builds social connection and a sense of belonging. And the other suggestion that we made together with Sarah was that we should make small but meaningful connections happen every day. And these don't happen by accident. I think people will recognise this in the room. You need to make them happen. You need to initiate one or two small social interactions every day, such as greeting your neighbours, chatting with the barista, sending a message to an old friend. And over time, these small moments gradually build stronger relationships. I'm not going to do too many more of these, but just to give you a flavour of the things that we're doing. So the other thing is to recognise that we're often very busy in our jobs. And when you're busy, it's easy for social interactions to get crowded out. So diarise it. Plan to make this happen. Set time aside each day or week for a social engagement, even if it's as simple as calling a friend, attending an event, or going for something like a park run. And, you know, if you get to one of those conversations, oh, let's have a coffee, and then you disappear off in opposite directions, it never happens. So when someone makes that idle comment, you know, follow up with an email, drop people a note. So let's get together and make sure that happens. So some small, actionable things that we can do in the workplace, and thank you for the brilliant carousels to Sarah and the team. And this is where it sometimes gets difficult. So, you know, when we talk about loneliness in the workplace, it sometimes gets drawn into what I'm going to call the culture war. So people fight in car parks about the relative merit of return to office versus working from home. And it has entered into the culture war. So, you know, it's become part of political discourse and political disagreement. And it's a sort of, it's one of the things that people have very strong views about. But one of the things I often see is people suggesting that we should all go back to the office because culture's important. Part of that culture is the fact that you're going to have lots and lots of water cooler moments and conversations are going to happen all the time. But the trouble is, if you get people back to an office that looks like that, and that's what the culture is, you're not going to cure loneliness, would be my suggestion. So I don't want to get too drawn into the culture wars, but it might be that that's where the conversation goes afterwards. So the other thing I'll finish by saying is, you know, we've talked about this, that happens to workers and doesn't happen to bosses, but it does. And leadership, I think, can be a really lonely place. And, you know, there'll be lots of people in the room that have got experience of this. And Isabel and I started this conversation just before Christmas, back at the end of 2024. And Isabel asked me what I thought about loneliness, and I highlighted the fact that leadership can be a lonely place, and we know that loneliness disproportionately affects CEOs, leaders, managers, wherever you find them, and turnover in that group's never been higher. So I'm going to finish pretty much by saying that leadership can be a lonely place. So I've just got a couple more thoughts. So Brian Wilson would say, surfs up, and I've got a few take-homes there, takeaways as Isabel might call them. So God only knows, just how important loneliness is. It's as bad as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So, you know, remember that fact when someone wants to talk about loneliness and why should be bothered it. Well, you know, wouldn't it be nice if we addressed loneliness in the workplace? So I think this is a must-have, not a nice-to-have. You know, if we're not thinking about loneliness in the workplace, then you're missing a trick, and organisations that don't think about this are going to be at a competitive disadvantage. So don't worry, baby, as Brian Wilson would say. So we've got some scalable, effective interventions, behavioural interventions, because of the work that we did during the pandemic, are now known to be clinically and cost-effective. But it's also about organisational culture, what Brian would have said, good vibrations. Okay, you see this is getting cheesier as it goes on. So organisational culture is really important when we think about loneliness in the workplace, and that's more than a discussion about whether we should all go back to the office. So thinking about hybrid working and distance working and the culture that is shot through organisations is really important. And I guess, as Brian would have said, I just wasn't made for this world. So don't assume that everyone wants to be part of the party. There are going to be a significant section of the workforce for whom hell is other people, and you know the bliss of solitude is going to be really important. So think about this whenever you're thinking about a conversation with loneliness. So at that point, I shall stop talking, and I'm looking forward to the chat and questions from the floor.
Right, I'm going to leave lots of time for questions. So I'm just going to ask you, Simon, if you're a manager in the room, what's the one thing you should be doing to help your staff?
Oh my word.
In sort of connection in the, you know, you've come to the office, it's all about the culture.
Yeah.
Is it about organised fun, or is it more about...
So it's not about organised fun, because people can spot that a mile off.
People spot that.
Exactly.
With the verandas match, central running.
Yeah, exactly that. So it's about, you know, giving people permission to speak to each other. It's about taking some interest in people's lives outside of the office, but not encroaching on that. And I guess sort of leading from the front and ensuring that there's a broad interest in people's well-being, and it's not forced and it's not box-ticking exercise. So I think leadership's really important. I think, you know, demonstrating that you're interested in this and creating a culture that, you know, does recognise the importance of social interactions and makes those happen in a small way without doing the forced fun thing. So I'm all against forced fun.
Thank you for saying that. Right, I'm going to throw it over into the audience. I've got lots of other questions, but I hope you have too.
Now my question was, you mentioned that you did the trial during COVID and that was very successful and saw a percentage decrease in depression and anxiety. I think you said it was eight sessions?
Yeah, 6 to 8 sessions.
I just wondered what kind of thing, it sounded as if it was done by the telephone, but what kind of thing happened within those sessions that was so successful?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And one of the things that we do is we look at the bottom line effects of the interventions in terms of the proportion of people who improve in terms of depression, anxiety and levels of loneliness. But we also spend a bit of time understanding what goes on within those sessions. So we have transcripts, and we also do quite a few interviews with people who've had positive and not such positive experiences of the treatment. And so within those sessions, we train people over about 3 days to be able to work to a structured programme. So this isn't befriending, it's not ringing up and being someone's mate for 30 minutes. It's whilst we're here, let's think about what the immediate problem is. And let's think about strategies that you've used in the past that have been useful in helping you maintain social interaction and what the benefits of that might be. And you help people to capture what's been successful before, think about the activities that they've had, and get people to come up with a schedule so stuff doesn't happen by accident. You know, when I get up, I'm going to do this activity. And you try to mix up some purposeful activities, like, you know, I've got to call someone to pay the gas bill, with some social interactions that might be on the telephone or might involve going knocking on someone's door, starting a conversation. So this happens in a structured fashion, and it happens on a session by session fashion, and we look at what works and what doesn't between each session. There's a little bit of homework set, so we decide what we're going to do between now and the next session. We know that actually engaging in the homework between sessions is where the magic happens. So going out and practicing it and working out what the benefits are for yourself, and if things don't work, then going back to square one. And as we get to the end of the 8-session programme, you spend some time thinking about what's worked, what's kept you well, and how you're going to maintain those things after the sessions have finished. So befriending and dependence are not what this is about. It's empowering people to make social connections and to continue making those, and to break that cycle of unhelpful behaviours and how that negatively impacts on your mood. So in a nutshell, that's what it is. Sounds a bit fancy pants, but doing stuff makes you feel better. And if you're feeling grotty in the morning, Isabel likes this phrase, follow the plan and not the mood. So, and that has loads of benefits. That's at the heart of behavioural activation, which is the intervention that we use.
I started thinking about that in the morning when I don't fancy getting out of bed. Right. Other questions?
I think we've got mics as well now.
We've got mics now. Yes, at the back here.
Did you find that self-discipline was an issue with that? So people are working from home and therefore they're dependent on themselves to follow the plan.
Yeah.
How much was self-discipline an issue, and how did you help people overcome that?
It's a great question. I'm not sure I've got the answer to that one, but we know that being able to stick to the plan is really important if you're going to get the benefit from it. And having the discipline to stick with the homework tasks that you set in between sessions is really important. And procrastination's a big thing when you've got you're by yourself quite a lot. So that might be one of the problems that we might address within a behavioural strategy. If you're procrastinating too much, how do you turn that into small actionable solutions that happen on a regular basis on the basis of a schedule that you've set out? So self-discipline is at the heart of it, and the more you can engage with the homework tasks and the schedules, we know the more effective it is. So it's a sort of roundabout way of answering your question. We didn't specifically ask about self-discipline, but I think that's probably the closest we get to it in the trial.
So I was wondering if you think there's any problem with kind of self-recognition of loneliness. And what I mean by that is, so for example, young adults who have perhaps recently joined the workplace, whose later school careers and university careers were massively impacted by COVID. They probably were socially isolated, and that kind of feels normal, and there's some associated loneliness with that. So do you think that's led to a problem of people recognising that they're even lonely at all? Yeah, so it's become normalised to some extent, and I mean, loneliness is a normal human emotion for the reasons that I spoke about before. It becomes dysfunctional when it impacts on your life, and so I think a lot of young people would be experiencing loneliness in the way which I might understand it or you might understand it, but might not have a vocabulary for that. So social isolation, or withdrawing into the bedroom in particular, I read about, is being a bedroom kind of person. I'm no expert on this, but this is it's something that is part of the way in which younger people think and find themselves in unhelpful cycles of solitude just at the moment, and it's become part of young people's identities in many cases. We didn't get too many younger people in the trial, so it was mainly directed at older people, but my understanding would be that loneliness, people don't have a vocabulary for it, and it is a particular problem for younger people, particularly as they're entering the workplace just at the moment. So people have a negative experience of the workplace for the first time and they fall out quite quickly. So I think we're losing quite a lot of people from the workplace, and this might be one of the things that's driving it, Isabel.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because it is the 18 to 24s are they the fastest growing workers. So has anyone done research as far as you know on do they start in the workplace and then drop out, or do they never make it?
So they often drop out, and once you've dropped out and you've had a negative experience from your first job, my understanding, and anecdotally it's the case, that lots of people never quite get back into that first job, and that first job is so crucial in terms of creating expectations and normalising normal work patterns. And if you lose that at a particularly formative stage in your life, that's going to have long-term impacts that echo down the rest of your life.
Well, this is a difficult one for the teacher. I just want to follow up there. Do you think that the impact of things like TikTok and the kind of idealised world of work that Gen Z see there, come to work with me, I'm a hashtag girl boss, corporate girly, is it raising unrealistic expectations? This is something I've been thinking about a lot.
My sense is yes.
Yeah.
I'm no expert on this other than the facts. I've got children of a certain age, and I read the papers, and I'm conscious that I'm a boomer trying to think about these things in lots of ways.
We can all watch TikTok, Simon.
We can indeed, yeah.
Right, Joan.
That might be the quote of the festival. Forgive me, I'm married to a health economist, so this might be flavouring my thinking here, but on the scalability and the VFX, the productivity question, is there a world where you could model the benefits of having a national loneliness helpline, or that you reframe some of the job centre engagement with people who have struggled to get back into work or have fallen out of the workforce but could in theory get back into the workforce? Is there a possibility of modelling it such that you could say that this is a preventative measure that would actually pay for itself quite a lot, because you've proved that the first initial case does offer a return on the investment? So how would we scale it up where you could have something like the Samaritans or the Childline? What's the kind of opportunity to really scale up? This is a national helpline that would go alongside moving people back into the labour market.
So that's great. You've just mapped out what will be our knowledge exchange and route to market process there. So that's really useful. But we know there is going to be a return on investment for any intervention that you can devise that prevents the onset of depression, because of the downstream consequences of depression on your economic productivity and in the workforce. So preventing depression saves money, and we've known that for about 20-25 years, and it was most clearly articulated by a welfare economist, Professor Lord Richard Layard, about 25 years ago. And it underpins the rollout of psychological therapy services in this country. But what no one's ever done is been able to model that, in particular in relation to loneliness. But we've probably got the figures that would allow us to do that, and if we were to make a credible case for having a national a service that prevents loneliness, we know that if you can prevent a single case of loneliness, it generates about £8 for each £1 that you invest. So the return on investment is quite substantial. Preventing any form of mental distress actually saves money. So.
Wow. And have you been out talking to employers about this yet, or is this something that they come to you about?
Well, it's a conversation that's starting. So one of the reasons that we're keen to engage with the outside world is to tell people about the interesting stuff that we do in universities and find ways to engage with the broader economy, and that would include employers. So having scalable interventions that are useful in terms of improving the welfare of their workforce is a conversation that's sort of gaining momentum just at the moment.
Very much. Yes, but anybody else with a question? Yeah.
You mentioned calling someone up to pay your gas bill. I can't remember the last time a lot of us did that. As processes and become more online, more automated, we lose the opportunities for those chance encounters and transactional conversations, and as businesses strive to use more AI and more automation in their processes, how do we reduce exacerbating that problem?
Yeah, so that's a great point. So post offices would be a case in point, wouldn't it? So they're a great community asset, on the economic bottom line, they're probably not a very efficient investment in terms of the number of people that use them. However, as a community resource, it allows people to check in, and it allows the sort of micro interactions that you've alluded to. I worry that the shift to online life excludes many of those micro interactions that make us human. But I'm also conscious, particularly younger people, forge communities online, which are quite important to them. So in real life and online, we've got benefits and disbenefits. One of the things that we do worry about to flip the question a little bit, is digital exclusion. So lots of responses, particularly from employers, is to get an app for this or an app for that. And for many sections of the population, the application of mental health services or interventions that might prevent loneliness is desirable, but it does leave a lot of people behind. So in the trial that we spoke of, we deliberately had a solution that involved just a landline and didn't require people to be able to access complex hand computers, what do they call them? Phones. And so digital exclusion is a big thing, and that disproportionately impacts on poorer people, people who are marginalised for lots of reasons. So digital poverty and digital exclusion are big barriers to effective psychological interventions in the direction of travel for the NHS just at the moment.
Anybody else? Yeah.
I was hoping Sarah would ask a question.
Try not to make it too hard. It's just a little bit about the stigma, because I work for law care, and we are we're dealing with a broad range of mental health issues, and the stigma is a huge issue for pretty much every single thing. It doesn't matter which, the big long list, and I could pick any of them. And it resonated what you said about the leaders, because the leading by example, talking openly or starting those conversations is really important, because I just wondered if you thought that stigma, it's slightly related to your issue, your question about the idea of people, do they have the language to know and recognise when they, because I think there's two things, perhaps that they don't recognise it or they do recognise it, but who wants to admit that you're lonely, particularly if you're in a room full of people, that you're, particularly if you're responsible for them as well.
So language is really important. So particularly when we think about preventive interventions, so the first rule of prevention is you don't talk about the disease that you're trying to prevent. So interventions that try to prevent depression, we find a different vocabulary for talking about some of the things that capture the experience of depression. So it might be loneliness, it might be worry. And for loneliness, it's quite a stigmatising label, and people might not readily want to acknowledge or use that phrase for themselves, so we find other workarounds and phrases. So we spent a bit of time, this is where I look over to my colleague there, working with people who are experts by experience, and they help us check our language, to check that we're not using stigmatising language. So this notion of co-production, nothing about us without us, is right at the centre of what we do in our trials programme. And we've got a brilliant group of older people who were experts by experience who helped us design the intervention, and they were our harshest critics, but our best friends and greatest advocates. So I don't presuppose any language that we'll use in any intervention. So I'll talk about loneliness here, but it might not necessarily be the language that you use in the interventions that we design.
Anybody else? Oh, at the back.
Just a question about the trials. What did you find out in terms of age relations, but also gender, and also singleness, married, for those different profiles?
Well, social isolation affects everyone, so it doesn't discriminate. Some people are disproportionately impacted, but it worked for pretty much everyone who went in the trial. So there was no section of the trial population for whom it didn't work. We couldn't say it worked better for men or women. It seems to be one size fits all, really. But we do contextualise the nature of the interventions that personally you're dealing with, so we might speak differently depending on where people are at in terms of their fluency, their particular cultural and social experiences. We might use different language according to people's gender.
Anyone else? Simon, what's the next steps before we wrap up?
So this will probably be the last trial I do in my career, so we don't want to do any more trials. One of the things we're really keen to do, particularly in universities, is to take the stuff that we do here and bring it out to the outside world. So we sometimes call that knowledge transfer and knowledge exchange. So trying to find ways to scale this and bring it into the NHS or into the workplace. And that's a conversation we're trying to do. So trying to think about what the pain points are for organisations and trying to see how things that we've done here and that I've spoken about might help people who are in charge of the purse strings in organisations recognise the value of investing in that. So that's it's a contact sport. We spend a bit of time engaging with employees who want to work with us, working with charities for whom loneliness is important. So we've got some really great work that we're doing with Law Care, and we can think of a couple of other employers that are interested in, taking those first steps and bringing this into the workplace.
Forward to it. It's so important. Simon, thank you so much. It was a brilliant talk. Thank you for all your excellent questions, and thank you for coming.
Thank you.